It is assumed that after watching Israel's long-distance raids on Uganda's airports, the United States military felt that it could do the same. In 1980, in order to save the hostages, planned a vast multi-service joint operation. But this envisioned group Desert 2-day trip met with big trouble, froze into the US military to dig a pit for themselves. In 1979, an Islamic revolution, Iran from a pro-US secular country into a religious country. The advanced weapons given to Iran by the US were now all chicken and egg, cheapening Khomeini. To top it all off, the Iranian masses expressed their anger at President Carter for allowing the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi, to flee to the US. More than 3,000 armed students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 66 people inside hostage, demanding that the US repatriate the president. After arduous negotiations, the armed students released some of the women and blacks, but the remaining 52 people said nothing. Negotiations have reached a stalemate. The Americans did not expect this group of everyday to raise a camel to read the scriptures, how to be so shaft. In a fit of pique, the senior management decided to do a big job, deployed special forces, long-distance raids, deep behind enemy lines, to save the hostages, in order to make a good luck, but also a cool hanging day action code, Eagle Claw Action. Because this action is directly led by the Department of Defense, the entire Pentagon are boiling, land, sea, air, special forces. All branches of the military have been on the table, hoping to compete for dominance. After all, this kind of classified project. Which means that classified funding, anyone who sees such a bunch of invoices do not need to be invoiced for the white flowers of silver will be read. After repeated discussions among the bigwigs, the scale of Operation Eagle Claw is getting bigger and bigger. Due to the limited intelligence and the fear of manpower shortage, the Delta Special Forces, the Rangers, as well as the urban street fighting special forces stationed in Germany, all of them are stuffed in. How to get this pile of soldiers to their destination? That's the big question. Those American hostages are being held in the US Embassy in downtown Tehran, surrounded by a lot of Iranian people, about 5 million front to back. Into such a big city to capture people, now look at, but any long intention also dare not think so. But the US, at that time, was so flabbergasted that it not only dared to think that way, it also dared to do it. After much research, Operation Eagle Claw made a complex plan. In the first step of the operation, in the dark of night, a commando group of 118 Delta and Ranger troops took off from Mazaira Island, Oman, in 3 C-130 transport planes, along with 3 other C-130s carrying fuel and war material, and proceeded to a roadside location approximately 320 kilometers southeast of Tehran, which was set up as a rendezvous point for Desert 1. At the same time, 8 Navy RH-53 DC Stallion helicopters took off from the aircraft carrier Nimitz, and traveled empty to Desert 1 to rendezvous with the C-130s for refueling. Then they went with the commandos to the Desert 2 assembly point on the outskirts of Tehran, where they stayed hidden during the day. I can't imagine how they stay hidden during the day. After dark the next day, Iranian CIA agents would lead 6 trucks to pick up the commandos and feel their way into Tehran to rescue the hostages. At the same time, the 8 helicopters of Desert 2 arrived at the Tehran stadium and stood by. Another group of Rangers arrived at the Iranian airbase of Manzariya in the southwest corner of Tehran in 2 C-130 transport planes, landed forcibly and seized the airfield, awaiting evacuation. By this time, the Tehran operation should have been completed, with the commandos taking the hostages to the stadium, boarding helicopters and flying them to Manzariya airbase, where the hostages were transferred to C-130s for the return flight, while 8 helicopters were blown up on the spot. Throughout the operation, an E-3 AWACS and an AC-130 air gunship provided support over Tehran. It's a beautiful plan, tightly articulated in every way, with seamless troop coordination and no flaws, but it's just beautifully overdone. How to look at this long-distance running plan are like sitting in the office to write out. The complexity of the operation is hellish. Just transfer to change planes need to be 4 or 5 times, but also have to use different means of transportation and transportation. But where one of the links out of order, the whole operation will have to dry eyes. Not to mention actual combat on an unfamiliar battlefield. Even if a team of 200 traveled around Iran under these conditions, it would be nice to come back unscathed. But everyone did not object to the plan. The Delta Special Forces, since its inception, this is the first time to carry out a real combat mission, but also to hold their energy ready to make a big show. On April 24, 1980, the operation, which amounted to a full-scale invasion, began. At 6 p.m., 6 C-130s took off from Mazaira Island, Oman, and headed for Desert 1, 1,800 kilometers away. At 19:30, 8 RH-53DS took off from the Nimitz at sunset, arriving at the same time as the transports. Murphy's Law has a rule that everything that can go wrong, will go wrong. Operation Eagle Claw began, the RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopter began to make a demon. No wonder. Originally they are Sea Stallions, how can the desert to show off their skills? 2 hours after takeoff, a helicopter with the call sign Bluebeard 6 had rotor problems and was forced to land in the desert, and the crew had to transfer to Bluebeard 8 to catch up with the formation, and in their haste, they forgot to self-destruct and abandoned the helicopter in the desert. As the helicopters penetrated deeper into Iranian airspace, the Bluebeard helicopter formation encountered a sandstorm, which the Iranians call Habubu. The high-altitude transports were fine, but the low-flying Bluebeard formation suffered, and the fine sand and dust drilled into the engine along the gaps, constantly challenging the engine's working limits. The cockpit was filled with choking sand and dust, and the temperature kept rising. The pilots were suffering and kept swearing. But it's no use cursing. Habubu doesn't understand English. Soon after, Bluebeard 5 received the good news that its navigational instrumentation system had failed. Flying by sight alone in an impenetrable sandstorm is extremely dangerous, so the pilot yelled, "Sorry guys," and turned back. The funny thing is, he was almost out of the sandstorm area. At this time to return to the flight is the same as from the sandstorm area to start flying again. This meal sand down, the next day's breakfast will be saved. This leaves only 6 helicopters out of 8. And 6 helicopters is the minimum to carry out the mission based on the number of commandos. Things weren't over on the helicopter formation side, and they weren't idle on the transport side either. At 22:45 local time, the C-130s landed one by one on the highway at the Desert 1 assembly point. After unloading, the 2 C-130s returned to make room for the upcoming helicopter formation. After prior investigation, Desert 1 assembly point of the highway is semi-abandoned, basically no traffic. In order to keep the operation secret, the plan stipulates that as long as the Iranians passing through here, all of them should be detained, in order to prevent the leakage of information. But the special forces on board the transport plane had just begun to move when they saw a bus full of civilians approaching, and they had to immediately stop the bus and capture the 44 people on board. The mission had only just begun, and they needed to set up a prisoner of war camp. The POW campsite hadn't been dealt with yet, when a tanker truck and a pickup truck drove onto the highway again. The special forces cried and laughed, "Wasn't this an abandoned highway?" The tanker driver looked up, full of airplanes and soldiers, directly scared silly, thinking, "I'm not just smuggling a gasoline, need such a big battle." In a hurry, he stepped on the gas and accelerated to escape. Delta saw the enemy to run, go up is a rocket. The tanker instantly shot up into the sky, and there was a driver in the car, but the other party was very smart. Jumped into the pickup truck and fled the scene. In the middle of the vast desert, the tanker truck burst into flames, illuminating the assembly point of Desert 1, and the boys of the special forces looked at each other in disbelief. At this moment, everyone was asleep and probably couldn't see the place. But the fire did give the flying helicopter a surprise. The Army brothers are really sweet. In the light of this fire, we guarantee a good descent without incident. When the last helicopter landed, 90 minutes after the scheduled landing time, the ground crew rushed to start refueling the helicopter, only to discover that Bluebeard 2 had another problem. The sand and dust had blocked its fuel pumps, and the engine completely shut down. At this time the sky is almost dawn. Desert 2 is still in the sky, and only rely on these 5 helicopters is certainly not able to send all the people over. Looking at the dusty face exhausted helicopter pilots, Delta Commander Beckwith finally admitted that this trip feng shui is not right. Helplessly reported to the headquarters of the situation. After hearing the request to return to the front, President Carter was also relieved. After all, it is better to return without success than a total loss of troops are. But just as everyone was packing their bags and getting ready to return home to go, they had another problem. There were 5 helicopters left, and in order to make room for Bluebeard 4 to refuel, Bluebeard 3 had to take off and move to the side. But just after the number 3 flew up, the sand and dust stirred up by the rotor blurred the pilot's vision, causing him to miscalculate and push the stick forward, instantly crashing into the tail of the EC-130 refueling tanker in front of him, instantly killing 8 US troops, seriously burning the helicopter's pilot and co-pilot, and leaving Desert 1 in a sea of flames. Now, the Americans completely believe in evil, originally wanted to clean up before leaving. Now even clean up do not dare, all rush to the C-130, just want to hurry home. 5 RH-53D helicopters, so stay in the Desert 1, due to the fear of helicopter fuel and ammunition explosion, and even self-detonation are exempted. Along with the previous left behind, Bluebeard 8 all left to Iran. The Iranians turned around and integrated Bluebeard 2 and Bluebeard 8 into their own navy. Later, the Desert 1 assembly point became a base for Iranian anti-American propaganda and a place of entertainment for the general public. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw, which was subsequently covered extensively by the media, humiliated the Carter administration and ultimately led to President Carter's re-election defeat. 7 months later, the US hostages were finally released in exchange for a promise to unfreeze Iran's monetary assets, and a promise never to intervene in Iranian affairs again. Investigations revealed that a serious lack of coordination and unity of command among the services was the primary reason for operational failures, which led directly to the creation of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, USACOM, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. At the same time, a series of helicopters dedicated to special operations began service. U.S. Special Operations, thoroughly, by moving from the margins to the center.